Imagine walking down a street in London, Berlin, or New York in 1943. Everywhere you look, the walls are shouting at you. It isn't just advertising for soap or cigarettes anymore. It is a bombardment of ideology. We are looking at a time when art was weaponized. Welcome to our deep dive into the psychological battlefield of World War II. Today, we are exploring how nations on every side of the conflict waged a war for the minds of their people. Look at this collage of images. It feels chaotic, doesn't it? That is by design. From bold, terrifying warnings to inspiring calls for glory, this was the visual language of the 1940s. Whether it was the stark typography of German posters or the colorful illustrations of American campaigns, the goal was identical. We see slogans in different languages, but the urgency is universal. In this episode, we are going to deconstruct these images. We will uncover how governments manipulated truth, mobilized millions, and convinced ordinary people to sacrifice everything for the state. This is the story of persuasion, fear, and the power of the printed word. Before we analyze the specific campaigns, we must answer a fundamental question. What is propaganda? In the context of the Second World War, it wasn't just news. It was information specifically curated to promote political causes. Governments realized early on that modern warfare wasn't just about bullets and bombs. It was about morale. To keep a nation fighting, you had to control the narrative. This involved selective truths, wild exaggerations, and intense emotional appeals. The key question facing every leader, from Roosevelt to Hitler, was simple. How do you persuade a peaceful citizen to pick up a gun? How do you convince a mother to send her son to die? The core goals of wartime propaganda were twofold. First, to mobilize populations for military service and maintain high morale among the citizens left at home. If the home front collapsed, the war was lost. Second, they had to demonize the enemy forces. You had to make the enemy look like a monster, while simultaneously creating a unified national identity and a sense of shared purpose. It was about creating an us versus them dynamic that could survive years of hardship. When we look at the massive output of propaganda during the war, the messages generally fall into four distinct categories. You can think of these as the four pillars of the home front effort. First, there was recruitment. Nations needed bodies on the battlefield. Posters encouraged citizens to enlist in the armed forces through intense patriotic appeals. They weren't just asking for employees. They were creating a sense of duty and honor in military service. Second, and perhaps most pervasive, was war financing. Armies run on money. Governments had to sell war bonds to citizens to fund these massive military operations. The messaging here was clever. It connected your financial support directly to battlefield success. Third was national unity. To win a total war, you cannot have internal fighting. Propaganda focused on eliminating dissent and creating a shared national identity across all citizens. It was about building a consensus around war aims and the requirements of sacrifice. Finally, we have resource conservation. This was the war invading the kitchen and the garage. Citizens were encouraged to save vital resources, including food, fuel, and metal. The genius of this propaganda was that it made rationing and sacrifice feel patriotic rather than burdensome. Every scrap of metal saved was a bullet for the front. Let's look closer at the psychological gears turning behind these images. One of the most potent tools in the propagandist kit was the demonization of the enemy. It wasn't enough to say the enemy was wrong. They had to be portrayed as evil, subhuman, or dangerously aggressive threats. If you view your opponent as a human being, you might hesitate. If you view them as a monster, you strike. To counter this darkness, they used patriotic symbols. In America, it was Uncle Sam. In Germany, the figure of Germania. These figures stood tall, often accompanied by slogans like "Stand Strong" or "United We Endure." These campaigns relied heavily on emotional and psychological appeals. They aimed to trigger visceral reactions: fear for your family's safety, pride in your country, or guilt for not doing enough. And they packaged these complex emotions into catchy slogans. Phrases like "loose lips, sink ships," or "dig for victory" weren't just rhymes. They were instructions embedded into the public consciousness. They made complex security concepts simple enough for a child to understand. Propaganda didn't just appeal to your private conscience, it weaponized your social standing. This brings us to the bandwagon technique. The message was clear: everyone is doing it, and so should you. This created immense social pressure. It played on the fear of isolation. If you weren't buying bonds or collecting scrap, you weren't just lazy. You were an outcast. The goal was to make non-participation feel socially unacceptable and unpatriotic. To reinforce this, governments utilized the testimonial strategy. Just like modern influencer marketing, they used famous figures, movie stars, and decorated soldiers to validate war messages. Imagine seeing your favorite silver screen actress, elegant and poised, holding a war bond. It glamorized the war effort. Celebrity endorsements were crucial in selling war bonds and encouraging public participation. It bridged the gap between the distant battlefield and the local movie theater, making the war effort feel trendy and essential. Now, we must turn to the darkest chapter of persuasion: Nazi propaganda. This was known as the machinery of lies. At the center of this web was Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda. He exercised what can only be described as total control. Goebbels strictly censored all press, radio, film, and artistic expression within Germany. There was no alternative viewpoint, only the party line. The narrative they constructed was built on two pillars: supremacy and hatred. They created the myth of the Aryan master race, telling the German people they were biologically superior. Simultaneously, they promoted virulent anti-Semitism, blaming Jewish people for all of Germany's misfortunes. This wasn't just political campaigning. It was state-sponsored psychological conditioning designed to prepare a population for genocide and total war. Central to the Nazi propaganda machine was the Führerprinzip, or the cult of Hitler. Hitler wasn't just presented as a chancellor or a politician. The propaganda apparatus presented him as a godlike savior. The slogan "One people, one empire, one leader" dominated the visual landscape. Look at the imagery used here. The visuals consistently showed Hitler as strong, fatherly, and resolute. He was often depicted alone, looking toward the horizon, or elevated above adoring crowds. This imagery demanded absolute obedience above the law. The message was that the leader embodied the will of the nation. To question him was to question Germany itself. Banners proclaimed strength in unity and forward to glory, creating a narrative where the only path to the future was through total submission to one man. The Nazis were early adopters of mass media technology to enforce their will. Two specific examples highlight their approach. First, there was film. The 1935 film Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, is a masterpiece of filmmaking used for a terrible purpose. It glorified the Nazi Party using powerful cinematic techniques, sweeping camera angles and synchronized marching to make the movement look invincible. Conversely, they released vile anti-Semitic films like The Eternal Jew in 1940, which compared Jewish people to vermin. Second, there was the radio. The regime produced the People's Receiver. These were cheap, mass-produced radios designed with a limited range. They ensured that all Germans could hear Hitler's speeches daily in their own homes. Crucially, the control was absolute. Listening to foreign radio stations, like the BBC, was strictly forbidden. In fact, it became a capital crime punishable by death. They literally controlled the airwaves to ensure no outside truth could penetrate the German mind. Across the Atlantic, the United States took a different approach. In 1942, the government established the Office of War Information, or OWI. While the Nazis focused on racial purity and blind obedience, the OWI coordinated government messaging by focusing on the four freedoms outlined by President Roosevelt. The propaganda explained why the U.S. fought. It was a defense of liberty versus tyranny and fascist aggression. The U.S. also enlisted Hollywood. Famous directors like Frank Capra were brought in to create the influential Why We Fight documentary film series. There was a distinct difference in tone compared to dictatorships. While still manipulative, American propaganda generally appealed to civic duty rather than fear. It treated the citizen as a partner in the defense of freedom rather than a subject to be commanded. In the United States, the most common theme in posters wasn't combat, it was economics. The central message was simple: if you can't fight, you can pay. War bonds were the primary method for financing the fight. The government needed billions of dollars to build ships, tanks, and planes. To get those dollars, they used heavy emotional guilt tactics. Posters would show children in danger, suggesting that buying a bond would keep the war away from American shores. Others depicted battered soldiers sacrificing their lives, asking the viewer if they could simply sacrifice a few dollars. Images of a stern Uncle Sam holding bonds became iconic. It was a direct transaction. Your money bought the equipment that saved lives. It turned the act of investment into an act of combat. The war created an unprecedented labor shortage. With millions of men overseas, the factories needed workers. This necessity birthed one of the most famous icons of the 20th century, Rosie the Riveter. Propaganda began aggressively breaking gender barriers. J. Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster was designed to recruit women to fill these factory labor shortages. But notice the nuance in the imagery. These posters glamorized industrial work while emphasizing strength without losing traditional femininity expectations. The women were depicted as capable and strong, rolling up their sleeves, but often still wore makeup and had perfectly styled hair. It was a careful balancing act, changing the role of women in society just enough to win the war, while trying to maintain social norms. The war effort extended into the backyard and the driveway. The Victory Gardens program was a massive success in mobilizing the civilian population. The national motto became, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." This was about total resource management. Astonishingly, Americans grew 40% of their own vegetables in home and community gardens. Posters screaming, "Grow for victory," turned a vegetable patch into a defense installation. Fuel was another battleground. Propaganda targeted carpooling and fuel conservation. One famous poster warned, "When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler," implying that wasting gas was practically aiding the enemy. Even children were mobilized. They organized scrap drives, collecting vital materials like rubber, tin, and paper. The message was clear: your garden strengthens our home front. We must now address the ugly side of Allied propaganda, the dehumanization of the enemy. When depicting the Germans, US and UK propaganda often reached back to history, depicting them as barbaric Huns. The goal was to desensitize soldiers and civilians to the idea of killing enemy combatants. However, the depictions of the Japanese were distinctly different and deeply racist. Japanese soldiers were frequently shown with offensive caricatures, including buck teeth and thick glasses. While anti-German propaganda focused on the Nazi ideology or the Kaiser, anti-Japanese propaganda focused on the race itself. This led to intense fear and hatred of Japanese Americans back home. the propaganda machine was effective, but it fueled a racial animosity that would have tragic consequences for civil liberties in the United States. On the other side of the Pacific, the Empire of Japan had its own complex narrative. Their propaganda operated under the theme of Asia for Asians. They positioned themselves as liberators, claiming to free the continent from Western imperialism through what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The imagery was often aspirational, showing Japan leading other Asian nations into a modern future. However, the reality differed drastically from the posters. The Japanese occupation proved to be brutal. Japan also engaged in psychological warfare against Allied troops. The famous Tokyo Rose radio broadcasts targeted Allied troop morale, playing nostalgic music and suggesting that the soldiers' wives back home were being unfaithful. It was a sophisticated attempt to break the will of the fighting man. In Britain, the propaganda took on a tone of stoic resilience. We are all familiar with the famous "keep calm and carry on" slogan. The British strategy focused heavily on resilience during the Blitz. The BBC became the trusted news source, a voice of calm in the chaos. Winston Churchill utilized the V for Victory campaign, popularizing the iconic hand gesture to signal hope and defiance. But the British also wielded a unique weapon: humor. They used humor as resistance. By mocking Hitler through cartoons and satire, they reduced public fear. If you can laugh at a monster, he becomes less terrifying. British wit became a legitimate weapon against Nazi psychological warfare tactics. In the Soviet Union, the approach shifted dramatically when the German invasion began. Interestingly, the propaganda focused less on communist ideology and more on the defense of the motherland, or Rodina. The iconic poster, "The Motherland Calls," shows a woman holding the military oath, urging her sons to battle. Soviet propaganda was visceral and violent. It depicted German soldiers not just as enemies, but as beasts destroying Russian villages. The imagery was highly emotional, often showing weeping mothers or dead children. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about survival. The goal was to incite a burning hatred that would fuel the Red Army all the way to Berlin. Propaganda wasn't always serious posters and grim speeches. It also entered the movie theater in the form of cartoons. The role of animation in propaganda was significant. Disney produced the Oscar-winning short Der Führer's Face, which featured Donald Duck. It used humor to brutally mock the Nazi regime. Other Disney films were educational, explaining things like tax payment and malaria prevention to the public. Warner Bros. Joined the fight too. Bugs Bunny cartoons showed the famous rabbit fighting Japanese soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Why use cartoons? Because they were effective. Animation disarmed audiences with humor while delivering serious messages. It allowed the government to reach children and adults alike, normalizing the war effort through beloved characters. One of the most direct forms of propaganda was delivered from 20,000 feet. Both sides engaged in dropping leaflets over enemy lines. Imagine being a soldier in a frozen trench, and thousands of papers rained down from the sky. Some of these were safe conduct passes, promising good treatment and food if enemy soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. Others were designed to terrorize. They used fear-mongering messages, telling soldiers, "Your leaders have abandoned you to die needlessly." These leaflets aimed to sow doubt and mutiny. It was a psychological assault, attempting to break the enemy's will to fight without firing a single shot. As we near the end of our analysis, we must acknowledge the dark side of propaganda's success. The relentless fear-mongering and racist imagery had real-world consequences. In the United States, propaganda fueled hysteria against Japanese Americans. The media landscape painted an entire ethnicity as an internal threat. This hysteria culminated in Executive Order 9066. This order led to the incarceration of 120,000 people based on ethnicity alone. Most were American citizens. They were stripped of their rights and forced into internment camps. This remains a stark reminder that while propaganda can unite a nation, it can also turn a democracy against its own people. To summarize, World War II was a clash of ideologies fought with weapons of mass persuasion. We saw a clear distinction in styles. Dictatorships like Germany and the USSR relied on state control, fear tactics, and forced compliance through violence. Their propaganda was a command. Democracies like the US and UK used a mix of commercial and state techniques, appealing to civic duty and voluntary participation. Their propaganda was a request, albeit a forceful one. However, we must face the uncomfortable truth that both sides used censorship and racist imagery to achieve their goals. Today, the posters have faded, but the techniques remain. The appeals to fear, the demonization of the other, and the rallying cries for unity are timeless tools of persuasion. Understanding how they were used in the past is the best defense against being manipulated in the future.